For my thoughts on all the latest happenings in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, be sure to check out my channel, JG9 News. And now, on with our feature presentation. How do you know when you stink? How do you know when your time is up and you can no longer be an effective player in the NFL? It seems like a rather easy question and basic question on the surface, but in theory, it's difficult because the answer is different for everyone. For some, you know right away when you walk into camp and you feel significantly slower than everyone else. And the things that are super easy for other players to do are incredibly difficult for you. For some, you know it when your stats decline, and when, from a production standpoint, you are not as effective as you once were. For some, it's when you feel like you're exerting a ton of energy into something that usually didn't take a lot of energy out of you. For some, you have to be told by an outside source, either because you got cut, or because no one claimed you off of waivers, or because you can't find a job. You get the idea. It's different for every single person that's played in this league, and there's no one right answer that lets you know that your career is over, and you're past your peak. But with this player that you've been watching this whole time, he had a, shall we say, much easier time realizing that his career was shot, and he wasn't going to be doing anything else. This man that you've been watching this entire time is Sonny Randle, and he was a very good receiver for the St. Louis Cardinals for a very long period of time, as we're going to break down in just a bit. In fact, he's one of the best receivers that the Cardinals ever had, and was one of the best receivers of the entire 1960s, and I do not say that lightly. But the ending to his time with the Cardinals was, shall we say, very unceremonious. Or actually, scratch that. Extremely ceremonious for all the wrong reasons, because by the end of his time with the Cards, he was so bad that, I kid you not, other players and coaches were celebrating how much he sucked. Seriously, that's when you know you're toast. When your own teammates and coaches are acknowledging the fact that you completely stink. And nearly 60 years later, we're going to break down this bizarre story today. Because this is the story behind Cardinals wide receiver Sonny Randle, and how one piece of cake ended his NFL career. Before I break down exactly what happened and when the writing was on the wall for Sonny Randle, we need some context to understand, well, just who Sonny Randle was, because he didn't used to be so bad. In fact, Randle was one of the best receivers of the entire 1960s, and like I said before, I do not say that lightly, because there were many great receivers in that era, from the likes of Bob Hayes, to Charlie Taylor, to Roy Jefferson, to Homer Jones, to a bunch more. But Randle was near the top. Randle was drafted by the Cardinals in the 19th round of the 1958 NFL Draft, and he looked like the greatest steal ever when in 1960, he was named an AP First-Team All-Pro and a Pro Bowler by finishing the season with 62 receptions for 893 yards and 15 touchdowns. Not only was the 62 receptions second in the league, only behind Raymond Berry of the Baltimore Colts, and not only was the 893 yards fourth in the league, but the 15 receiving touchdowns was the top total in football, which is even more impressive when you realize that only one other player even had more than 10 receiving touchdowns in 1960. In fact, Randle's 1960 season was so good that at the time, it was the third most receiving touchdowns by any player in NFL history, only behind Crazy Legs' total of 17 in 1951 and Don Hudson's total of 17 in 1942. Randle followed that up with another Pro Bowl season in 1961 and 1962, a 1963 season where he had over 1,000 yards receiving and 12 touchdowns, which was third in the league, and a 1965 season where he made the Pro Bowl yet again. By this point in Randle's career, entering the 1966 season, he was a 4-time Pro Bowler and was slowly but surely working his way up the record books, to the point where with a few more good seasons, we could legitimately talk about him as a Hall of Famer. Just to give you an idea of how good Randle was entering the 1966 season, as in the main season in our story, Over his career, Randle had 311 receptions for 5,220 yards and 58 touchdowns. That's impressive for any career by any standards, but by the standards of 1965, that was historically good. His 58 receiving touchdowns ranked tied with Hugh Taylor for the 9th most in pro football history, and with 2 more touchdowns, he would become just the 8th player to ever eclipse the 60 touchdown mark. His 311 receptions ranked inside the top 25 ever, as did his 5,220 receiving yards. Look, there is no debate today as to who the greatest receiver in Cardinals franchise history is, because everyone with a functioning frontal lobe will tell you that it's Larry Fitzgerald, and rightfully and understandably so. He will get into the Hall of Fame the moment the first ballot happens. However, there's a reason why when you ask people to name the second greatest receiver in Cardinals franchise history, even though the franchise has been around for over 125 years, that Sonny Randle is constantly mentioned. Even with all the other great receivers that the team has had, from the likes of Roy Green and Anquan Boldin and Bobby Joe Conrad, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, people keep coming back to Sonny Randle because he was that good. However, all of this was while Randle was on the right side of 30, because on January 6, 1966, something tragic happened to Randle that is never a good sign for just about any receiver who ever lived. He turned 30 years old. And once he turned 30, oh man, Father Time did not treat him well at all. Randle already had a late start to camp compared to everyone else, as he held out, unhappy with his contract offer, seeing as the Cardinals wanted to sign him to a multi-year deal, and Randle only wanted a 1-year contract. Then, once he did sign his contract, he was woefully ineffective, and looked like a shell of his former self, as despite playing in every game, he did next to nothing. The good news for the Cardinals was that to start off the 1966 season through 6 weeks, they were 5-0-1, and were positioning themselves nicely to make it to the first Super Bowl ever. The bad news was that they were doing it in spite of this man right here, Sonny Randle, who by this point in the year had 9 catches for 111 yards and 1 touchdown. That was it. That's incredibly pedestrian. Remember, this was a guy who, in 1965, made it to the Pro Bowl with 51 catches for 845 yards and 9 touchdowns. He was nowhere close to that pace in 1966. In 1965, Randle finished 9th in the league in receptions. 6 weeks into 1966, he was nowhere close to the top 10, as in the NFL, he was tied for 60th. In 1965, Randle finished 12th in the league in receiving yards. 6 weeks into 1966, he was 58th. You get the idea. Sonny Randle was not playing well, and was seemingly only getting worse, as he had no catches over St. Louis's last 3 games. But there was good news on the horizon, or at the very least, on paper there was. For a bit of that stretch, Randle was dealing with a broken right hand. Obviously, it's extremely tough to catch a football when you've got a broken hand. I think it goes without saying that you kind of need your hands to catch a football. It's kind of important. But by this point in 1966, there were no excuses, because the cast was going to be taken off. At long last, Randle's right hand was healed, and there was no broken bone in it anymore. If we were ever going to see the Sonny Randle of old, it was going to be right here, right now. If we were ever going to see Sonny Randle return to form and help the Cards offense out over the second half of the season as they look to make that push to first place and a playoff spot, it was right here, right now. With that, the cast was removed from his hand, and he was out there practicing in order to get ready for the team's Week 7 game against Washington. And out of all the practices that a player has had throughout the history of the NFL, this has to be up there for one of the worst of them all. Because Sonny Randle, quite simply, forgot how to catch. One of the best receivers of all time had no idea how to catch a football. He was already awful in 1966, but at least he had a built-in excuse thus far. There was no excuse here. It's like his hands were made of bricks, because every pass thrown his way, the ground was the one that ended up catching it. How many drops did Sonny Randle have on this day? In the words of LeBron James,
not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, not 6, not 7.
That's right, 8. 8 drops. Every pass that quarterback Charlie Johnson threw to him in practice was a complete lost cause. And look, everyone has bad days. Everyone has days where they are not at their best, but combined with everything else that we knew about Sonny Randle and how much he was struggling in 1966 as it was, this felt like the moment where the train officially left the station. This felt like the moment where Sonny Randle was officially washed up, was officially a shell of himself, and was no longer going to be an effective player in the NFL. And it was about to get so much worse. Because how bad was Sonny Randle now? How bad was that practice after an already bad season? After that practice, I kid you not, the Cardinals threw an entire party celebrating how much he sucked. They threw an entire party celebrating how over the hill he was. Because when practice ended, the Cardinals had cake in the locker room, and the chocolate cake had the word congratulations on it. What were they celebrating? They were celebrating Randle being terrible. As his receivers coach, Fran Polsfoot, said, that's for his new record. The record is for the most passes ever touched and then dropped in practice. The previous high was 6, a mark shared by Jack Elwell and a couple of others. The previous record was 6, and Randle was smashing that record with 8 drops in one practice session. And I feel like that has to be a sign that you don't have it anymore. Not just when you drop 8 passes and stink, but when you stink so much that your team, even if it was obviously in jest, celebrates your ineptitude in an already awful season for you. Said Randle on the incident, all I've got to say is that it was cold, and that the passes were all thrown by Charlie Johnson, who ought to share some of the credit. But yes, that's where we were at in Randle's career. He had bricks for hands, and not only did everyone know it, but everyone was sort of embracing it, and was embracing the fact that this once great receiver, and one of the best receivers in NFL history by this point in his career, was now god-awful and was absolutely terrible. And before even going any further, I'm just trying to imagine something like this happening today. Can you imagine Bill Belichick and his coaching staff buying cake for everyone and celebrating a player being bad in practice? Can you imagine Mike Tomlin or Tom Coughlin or Bill Parcells or any coach like that doing something in that vein? It seems almost too absurd to believe. Legitimately, this sounds like one of those stories that is completely made up. I should know that the head coach for the Cardinals in 1966 was Charlie Winter, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And he was notorious for having his teams collapse late in the season and failing to get the job done when it mattered most. We saw that in 1970, when the Cards seemed like a lock to make the playoffs and seemed like the best team in football with an 8-2-1 record, only to lose their final 3 games and be on the outside looking in. We saw that in 1967, when the Cardinals were 5-3 through their first 8 games and looked to be in a decent spot to make the playoffs, only for them to win just one of their final 6 games and end the year at 6-7-1. And we saw that during the season in question in 1966, when the Cards, despite starting the year 5-0, only won 3 of their final 9 games to end 8-5-1 and on the outside looking in, including a stretch over the final 3 games of the year where they lost all 3 games, including a loss to the expansion Atlanta Falcons of all teams, and they were really bad. And I don't want to say that this incident involving this man right here in Sonny Randle highlighted Charlie Winter's inability to finish and close out campaigns, but it definitely seemed like sloppiness was tolerated to some extent as the year went on, because it's hard to imagine too many other coaches doing that. But getting back to the man that you've been watching this whole time, in Sonny Randle, by this point, the writing was clearly on the wall. Because after the cake incident, Randle finished that season with just 17 catches for 218 yards and 2 touchdowns, all of which were the lowest totals of his career since the Cardinals moved to St. Louis in 1960. And by the start of the 1967 season, he was off the team, now a member of the San Francisco 49ers. Randle would do next to nothing in San Francisco and Dallas over the following 2 seasons, bouncing around between the 2 teams before his career came to an end after the 1968 season, with his production past the age of 30 falling off of a cliff, and a potential Hall of Fame career coming nowhere close to that due to how steep, how sharp, and how sudden his fall-off was. And the moment it all came crashing down, the practice from hell that led to the cake symbolizing his poor play. I think that's a good sign for a lot of people to hang it up, and for a lot of people to realize that they're officially over the hill and not that good anymore. When the entire team is celebrating how bad you are and is making fun of your poor play to the point where they buy a cake, that's probably a good sign that you don't have it anymore. Just a hunch. Let them eat cake has always been a disastrous phrase throughout the history of the world. And as it turns out, it was even a disastrous phrase in football. Who would have thunk? Because on this October day in 1966, it was very clear that the skies for Sonny Randle weren't going to be sunny anymore. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.